Hey everyone, good afternoon. Can we hear me? Does it sound good? Is this echoing? Are we good? Okay, all right. Hello and welcome to ISR and the Center for Inequality Dynamics, or CID. My name is Jeremy Levine, and I am an Associate Professor of Organizational Studies and Faculty Associate at the CID. And I am delighted to welcome you to this event featuring Jamila Michener of Cornell University. So I have a couple housekeeping items first to go over before introducing our participants for the event today. So first, if you don't already know, CID is funded thanks to a generous gift from the Stone Foundation. So thank you to our funders. And we're something of a one-stop shop for all things inequality research here on campus. Today's talk is sponsored by SWIPE, or the Stone Working Group on Inequality and Political Economy, which is a group within the CID that focuses more on the political and institutional dynamics of inequality. So every semester with SWIPE, we select a theme. This semester, it's power and housing justice. And SWIPE members read and discuss a few related articles, and then we put on an event with an outside speaker. And the framing here is we want to be as sort of generative as possible. So we're focused more on kind of collaboratively thinking through methodological or conceptual issues rather than just sort of like consuming research and then being on our way. So if you're not already on SWIPE or CID lists, and you'd like to be notified about workshops or other events that we have going on, there's a sign-in sheet going around. And you can also visit the newly created SWIPE website, thanks to Nicole in the back, which you can find under the Get Involved tab at inequality.umich.edu. Okay, so for today, our schedule of events will begin with Jamila presenting for about 25-ish minutes, followed by comments from Rob Mickey, and then a panel discussion with Rob and Jamila, moderated by Mo Torres, and then finally an open Q&A for all of us. Okay, so let me now formally introduce our everyone and all of our participants, and then I'm going to get out of the way so we can get started. Jamila Michener is, gotta take a breath, an Associate Professor of Government and Public Policy at Cornell, Senior Associate Dean of Public Engagement at the Brooks School of Public Policy, Director of the Cornell Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures, and an affiliate of the Center for the Study of Inequality. From 2011 to 2013, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation postdoc here at U of M, and we are delighted to have her back, if only for a couple days. Rob Mickey is an associate professor of political science who specializes in American politics with a wide range of substantive interests, from democratization in the American South to subnational political institutions to race and city governance. Mo Torres is finishing up a postdoc here before transitioning into an assistant professor of sociology and public policy, and studies the politics of post-industrial decline and the production of urban austerity, among several other topics related to inequality and political economy. With all that throat clearing out of the way, I will now hand it over to Jamila.
Thank you, Jeremy. I am. You don't have to clap. I am happy to be here. I was telling my son when I was talking to him earlier today that I had a good 2 years here. It was a good 2 years. And my son was actually born here. He's like, go by the hospital where I was born and take a picture. You know, it was so long ago. He's about to be 12. He was born here this week. On Friday is his birthday. And he's like, take a picture so I could see where I was born. We've visited here since then, and he's like never been interested, but now he has to give me work to do. But you know, there are some places, I don't know if everybody has this experience, but there are some places where like I have sad memories there, and it's like I'll just drive by and it makes me feel sad. And then there are places like here where just being in Ann Arbor sort of makes me chipper up a little, because I had very positive memories here. So it's good to see all of you. And I love how varied this room is. Like some of you I know, some of you I don't. So I would imagine we're from all different disciplinary and other backgrounds, which is great. I would like chat more because that's just the kind of person I am. But I'm going to be like a little disciplined today because I love this structure of like, I only talk for 20 or 25 minutes and then I have to shut up, and we have like a discussion that is broader than that. And the fact that that discussion can involve Rob Mickey and Mo Torres is like, I mean, it's no one asked me, right? But if you asked me, that might have been my choice anyway. So I love it when it works out that way. The chapter that I circulated is a chapter from a book that's like pretty done. It's like in copy editing right now. So usually I would not present something that there's not much of an opportunity for me to change. But the chapter and that book is really what is motivating my next project, which will focus on tenant organizing, the book that I'm working on now. And that's why I thought it would be a good entryway. So what I'm going to do in my 20 minutes is not try to cover everything that's in that chapter, but sort of explain to you the book, its arc, and how it became an entry point for me into what it is that I'm thinking about now. And then hopefully that means that we can have great discussion that'll give me ideas that I will absolutely use going forward. So looking forward to that. Some of this may be like, we know all this, and other folks may be less familiar. So I will assume nothing. I'll start from the beginning. And so one of the premises or the starting, an informational starting point for the book, this is the book that's already written, is that hundreds of millions of Americans face what we might call civil legal problems each year. So these are problems that are not, they generally don't involve any criminal infractions, although civil and criminal can overlap at times. And so, but we won't talk about that. For the most part, civil legal problems are non-criminal legal problems. Things like you're being evicted from your home, which is an example I'll use a lot today because we focus primarily on housing in the book. Or what happens if you have asbestos or lead or some other dangerous condition in your apartment or in your home, and you want to do something about it, right? Or you stop paying the rent to try to get the landlord to do something about it, and then they evict you, right? All sorts of issues like that. The civil legal sphere is much broader than that, right? So it involves a lot, right? So right now, one of the things that has the civil legal systems going absolutely haywire is that this is the realm that immigration falls within, right? It's the realm that family law falls within. So if you're figuring out custody issues, it's the realm that public assistance and the administration of public assistance benefits falls within. So if your benefits have been stopped or taken away for some reason, you're going to adjudicate that in an administrative court that is part of the civil legal system, and much more, right? So when we first, so this is a book that I wrote with a colleague of mine. Her name is Mallory Sorrell. She's an assistant professor, but in a couple months, she'll be officially associate at Duke University. And when Mallory and I first started, we were like, the whole civil legal system, we're going to do it all. Political scientists aren't paying attention to it. And then, you always start off a project with delusions of grandeur. And then you start to actually do it. And you're like, oh gosh, this is a lot. And some people have done good work in this space. So why don't we focus? And we decided to focus on housing after I had done some field work, ethnographic field work in housing courts. We thought there's just a lot going on here. Okay, people have these problems. What's interesting about that? Why study that? Or at least for me, why study that? Most of people who have what we might call legal problems don't actually receive any legal help with for those problems, right? And this is disproportionately the case for low-income households, many of which experience at least one civil legal problem, and some of which are experiencing mounting cumulative problems like this, right? So the challenge and the harm that can come from these kinds of problems is disproportionately concentrated in, not surprisingly, low-income communities. It's also disproportionately concentrated, also not surprisingly, among people of color, although there are plenty of white people who are losing out here too, and among women, right? So for me, as somebody who, the bread and butter of how I approach my work is to think about politics, power, and policy, what it means for racially and economically marginalized communities, and how, if at all, they can exercise any control over the outcomes in their lives. So as somebody who thinks a lot about these things, this is an area that I was drawn to. There's a longer personal story about how I got involved in, or I came to be interested in this research, but I'm being disciplined with my time, so I won't tell you that story. But if you want to hear it, just ask me. Anyway, This is the title of the book, although who knows if it's going to be the title, because our editor at Princeton reached out last week and he was like, we want to try some other titles. And we hated everything he suggested and said no. And now we're in a back and forth over titles. He thinks uncivil democracy is too vague, that people don't know what that's about. Yeah, but that's why you get the book. So you figure out what it's about. Anyway, maybe you'll see. When the book comes out, you'll see who won our battles. But what's at the core question at the heart of the book is, how do experiences with civil legal institutions, and yes, I will tell you what I mean by that, structure political life in race, class, subjugated communities? That's a lot. That's a mouthful, right? So what do we mean by civil legal institutions? Well, that actually changed over the course of the project, and I'll tell you about how. When we first started the project, really what we meant was civil courts, and because we were focusing on housing courts, and legal aid organizations or agencies, right? Because we're really interested in folks who are marginalized. And many of those folks, to the extent that they have any help that they're able to access with navigating their legal problems, that's going to come from legal aid agencies, because they can't afford to hire private attorneys. So we started off with that as our understanding of civil legal institutions. As we did the work, especially as I did the ethnographic qualitative piece of this, we added another institution, and that was community organizations, and specifically tenant organizations, because we came to find out that they were deeply embedded in many of these processes and practices. But had we done, for example, like a fully quantitative project where our starting assumptions were all we had, we wouldn't have, tenant organizations wouldn't have been a part of what we understood to be a part of this. And then I want to just say, and I'll get to this in a little bit, there's a reason why I say structure political life. I could say other things that would make me sound a lot more like a political scientist. First of all, I could say political behavior or political participation. And we are interested in those things. But I think about political life as a wider ambit, which I know is sometimes hard, because a wider ambit is like, but how are you going to measure it? And is it too analytically broad, and so on and so forth? But we really are interested in the ways that experiences with these institutions affect the meaning that people make in terms of their political world. And some of that ends up mattering for political behavior or political participation, and we make arguments to that end in the book. And some of it matters for like kind of classic political attitudes that political scientists have measured, like efficacy or trust. And again, we talk about those things in the book. But we also felt like there was more beyond that. The way that people thought about and talked about power, their place in the polity, the way they think about the economy, and with an analysis that was actually a political economy analysis that many people that we talked to had. They didn't call it that, but that's what it was. Just led us to decide that like political life, precisely because of its broadness and its capaciousness, was more what we were interested in. And I say structure, not effect. And the reason why is because we don't really focus very heavily on cause and effect in the book. It's a multi-method book, so some of our analyses are based on survey data, and we show some correlations. But really, we emphasize in the book that we're less interested in identifying causal relationships. That's important, and someone hopefully will read this book and their brain will light up about ways they might do that. And that might not have happened absent the book, and then they'll go and they'll try things, right? We're not opposed to that. But that's not exactly what we're up to, right? So we try to think carefully about how we describe what we're up to in the book so that we don't mislead people. I'm going to outline some of our larger arguments, and then I'm going to zoom in on the piece that I'll focus on today and that I think our conversation will be focused on. So first, that civil legal problems are politically meaningful, right? And maybe that seems obvious, although it's not something that's been established in the political science literature, at least directly, because these kinds of problems, like what does it mean for your democratic citizenship when you're in housing court, and when that's a place that you have to navigate frequently, and when you have to try to get a legal aid attorney, and maybe you get one, maybe you don't, maybe they help you, maybe they don't, maybe you know that they're funded by the federal government, maybe you don't, so on and so forth. What are the political implications of this? What does it mean to people? Just establishing the contours of that in the broadest sense was worthwhile. And we learned a lot from people when we talked to them about these experiences. And then we think about, because we care about political institutions and policies and their political implications, we think about legal counsel, for example, and what role it plays, right? So in the kind of access to justice community, which people, scholarly community, which people here may or may not be a part of, but in that community, there's a big focus on access to justice, and access to justice emphasizes like getting people lawyers, right? It really focuses on the sort of supply side of the issue of people need lawyers. If you have a legal problem, then you need a lawyer. It seems obvious. It's not rocket science. And to the extent that that's the focus, then the question is like, well, when people have lawyers, does that matter? Not matter for their material outcomes. We have really good evidence that it does, that they are less likely, for example, to be evicted or more likely to fare better in court or so on and so forth. Even if they lose in court, but for example, the eviction doesn't go on their permanent record, or there's lots of ways that a lawyer could help you. But again, what political meaning do people make of that, right, is something that we were really interested in, especially at the outset. Always we're interested in thinking about the ways that racial capitalism are implicated in these processes. So we not only do we find that civil legal problems, the problems themselves, the fact that you have to navigate these legal institutions has meaning for people, political meaning, and that when people are able to get access to a lawyer, that helps to foster political efficacy and trust, right? There are racialized differences in the experiences with civil legal institutions and in these relationships, these correlations that I'm pointing to here. So both that you experience civil legal problems in institutions and that you have counsel is particularly politically meaningful for Black and Latino folks, right? And we can talk about why and how we know this if people are interested. The broad argument that we end up making in the book, though, is that all of these things are really a part of what we might call a kind of regime of procedural justice, right? And in the book, we say that historically and contemporarily, we have some historical pieces in the book because my co-author, Mallory Sorrell, is like great in some archives. That's not my jam, but it's been really nice working with somebody for whom that is their strength. But historically and contemporarily, procedural justice, giving people, treating the problems that people have, something like eviction, as a legal problem, and then having people adjudicate those problems in a courtroom and giving them a lawyer to do that, right, ensures them, to the extent that that happens, and it doesn't, but that's not what happens in this country, but to the extent that that happens, it ensures procedural justice for people. And we really look at how procedural justice as an aim has actually been designed to maintain the political economic status quo. That's a different chapter that I won't focus on here. But if people are interested in that, I'm happy to talk about it. Just all of this evidence, actually just elected officials saying it explicitly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, many of them, that like, we're gonna have this legal services program to stop these people from rioting because they feel like they don't have any justice, right? So the idea is, this is how we control and quell unrest among people who are living in poverty, people who are experiencing racial and other forms of injustice. So procedural justice as a tactic to maintain the political and economic status quo. So great that there are some potential political benefits to procedural justice, particularly for racially marginalized people. But what is that actually producing, right? And then, and this is what I'll focus on for my next 9 minutes, we look at how grassroots political organizing to build power in these communities actually pushes beyond the limits, the ceiling of procedural justice, of legal justice, and promises something more transformative, something like an actual humane political economy where people won't have to be going to court and needing lawyers and fighting landlords that are openly being predatory with few other ways of being held accountable, right? So our core argument in the book really ends up being that economically and racially marginalized denizens need more than a lawyer. They need the power to transform the conditions that create their precarity. And I'll just say, we didn't start there. I actually really started like fascinated with whether right to counsel, like having access to a lawyer, was empowering. Like, does that help people to, understand themselves different politically, engage legal systems differently? Like, what are the kind of like implications of access to justice or access to legal counsel for people's power, right? That's how I started the project very much focused on legal systems, legal counsel. And still the book is about that. But by observing and learning from the actors that we wanted to know about, we were opened up to much more than that. And that's how we started focusing on organizing. I won't spend long here, and I won't talk much about the quantitative pieces because that's not in what we're talking about today. But for the qualitative pieces, I spent years doing ethnographic observation in housing courts in 3 different states, and also did many semi-structured interviews. And these tell you all the different people that we did interviews with, tenants who weren't part of tenant organizations, tenants who were, attorneys, many different places, lots of different ways of bringing these people into our orbit so that we really got range in terms of who we were talking to and what the nature of their experiences were. Really long qualitative appendix in the book. At first I was like, I'm gonna just throw this thing together, and then 25 pages later, you know, there's a lot of thinking here. I won't spend long on this, but I do want to say, just to reinforce, that our research aims really oriented around deep description. And sure, like, we think some of what comes out in the book is it is potentially elaborating causal mechanisms, which is why I said before, I would imagine there's someone out there who will read the book. Actually, I gave a talk a couple months ago at MIT, and someone there said, I could think of a way to do a field experiment. And I was like, oh, awesome. This is what we would hope that some people would want to do. But mostly we were focused in the book on building constitutive arguments, right? So like non-causal explanation, right? Really understanding like how things work, how we might think about the things, what the nature of the phenomena are, and what the implications of that are for ideas, concepts, and realities that we care about. And we also emphasize in the book that we're interested in charting political possibilities. That's really where the tenant organizing piece comes in. And I know we care a lot about probability as social scientists, and I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. But we really make an argument in the book for the importance of spending time as social scientists and as scholars charting the terrain of possibility, right? So when one of the first things people say to me when I start talking about the tenant organizing is like, oh, that's really niche, or that's not scalable, or I don't actually agree with either of those things. But even so, I'm like, you know, even if this isn't likely, if it's not frequent, if it's not probable, again, I don't actually agree with any of those arguments when it comes to tenant organizing. But even if it were true, I would say it was still worth us thinking through, right? Because it points to a set of possibilities that I would say we haven't attended to sufficiently. So I am not going to talk you through all the exact arguments that we make in the chapter. Instead, I want to talk you through one specific example. It's the example we start the chapter off with. And then there's lots more in the chapter. But I want to talk you through Tamara's housing journey, because Tamara's journey will reflect a lot of the insights that we build out in the rest of the chapter, and will also show you how we got to this point where the focus of the arc of the book ended with tenant organizing, but this next project that I have is picking it up. And the legal stuff isn't as much in the next project. The next project is really, what is the political economy of this thing called tenant organizing, and how can we think about the possibilities there? So Tamara. Tamara is a woman that I met in Louisville, Kentucky. I will not read everything that's on every slide, but I have highlighted things in red that you might want to pay particular attention to. But I'll tell you about Tamara, and you can read the slides to the extent that you want to. And Tamara started her housing journey when she was telling me about it in the era of COVID. So I will say I met Tamara through Bryson, her lawyer. Bryson heard about the study that I was doing because I was looking to interview like lawyers and people with legal problems, and had spread word among different networks. And I interviewed Bryson, but he also said, you should really interview some of these other people I work with. And there were a bunch of different contacts I got through Bryson, and lots of other lawyers in Louisville and throughout Kentucky. That the people are just so nice in that part of the country. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm like, why are you helping me? You don't even know me. And then I'm like, oh, that's not how everybody works, which is a relief. It's quite nice. But anyway, coming down the home stretch here. So Tamara was first almost evicted during the pandemic. She, like many other people, got COVID and was sick for a long time. So while she was out of work, she wasn't getting paid. She ended up not being able to pay her rent. Her landlord, as landlords don't want to do, filed for eviction. But her and her landlord were actually on good terms. He was like, I don't want to evict you, but I need this money. And so their plan was, well, the way that it worked, at least in Kentucky at this time, was you moved up the emergency rental assistance list once you had an eviction filed against you. So he filed the eviction against Tamara so she could move up the list so he could then get his money. They never planned for her to actually be evicted, but she ended up being evicted. And I'll tell you how. So this is, Bryson is talking about how he ended up coming across Tamara. So the way that Tamara ended up being evicted is that she got a number to call. This was when all the hearings were virtual. She got a number to call in for her hearing. And the plan was she would call in, she would say she applied for the emergency rental assistance. And at the time, once the judge heard that, it was like, great, keep it moving. We won't evict you. We'll wait for the ERAP to come through, right? And then the ERAP gets sped, the landlord gets their money, the tenant doesn't get evicted. Except the number that the court gave her was the wrong number. When she dialed in, there was nothing. And on the court end, it looked like she was a no-show. So they just gave a default judgment and they evicted her. Turns out they did this to a lot of people. A lot of people were no-shows because they gave them the wrong number. It's like the equivalent of saying, like, show up in room 305 for your court case, and you show up in room 305, but the case is happening in room 310. And then because you didn't go to room 310, you end up getting evicted. So legal aid doesn't deal with that. That's a class action thing. So they sent Tamara over to Bryson. Bryson heard from them and made Tamara the class plaintiff along with another woman who had the same experience, right? They were trying to get an injunction, like, you can't evict people. This is not right. They didn't end up getting the injunction. I won't prolong this point, but even though the court itself was entirely in the wrong and everyone recognized that that was the case, they still allowed all those people to continue to be evicted. Didn't get the injunction. Okay, it ended up working out. Tamara's landlord decided not to evict her. He just waited for the emergency rental assistance, and she didn't get evicted that first time, but just because of the kindness of her landlord, not because of any legal help. 2 years later, though, a tree falls on the house, and Tamara's looking for another option because the tree fell on the house. And she stumbles across her dream home. This isn't it. This is just a picture I put up of what I imagined she might have thought her dream home looked like, right? Her dream home, of course, was a nightmare that was a function of a predatory scheme. I promise I'm almost done. So she's on Facebook. She's searching for homes. She keeps finding all these homes by a company named Main Street Renewal. Main Street Renewal is a real company. If you look at them, if you look it up, you'll find them. Main Street Renewal goes to cities like Louisville, especially to parts of the city that are not in great condition, so mostly low-income, hyper-segregated Black and brown communities, and they buy up a whole bunch of houses, right? Hundreds, actually in Louisville, thousands of homes. And they hold on to them because they know that gentrification is coming and that eventually those homes will be worth more. They hold on to them until the market is at a place where they can maximize their profit, and then they sell them off to the gentrifiers. And in the interim, which is often years, they're just holding on to that property. So they're constraining the market, making it harder for the people who live in those communities to find housing. So it's not at all uncommon when you're searching for property that many of the properties are going to be rented by Main Street Renewal. Unfortunately, fraudsters know this as well. They also know that Main Street Renewal has so many properties that they can't actually oversee all of them. So what they do is they get locksmiths to break into the properties, and then they fakely rent out these properties. I mean, they have you sign a lease, they give you a key, everything, right? And Tamara comes across one of these fraudsters, Tristan. Tristan makes it look like this is legit. She signs a lease and everything. It takes 4 months before Main Street Renewal realizes that Tamara is living in a home that they haven't rented to her. By then, she's paid Tristan thousands of dollars, right? Really, nobody can do anything about this. The police, when Tamara ended up talking to the police, they're like, oh man, you're the fourth family that's happened to. You lasted real long. I mean, they tell her that she's lasted long. They know this is happening. They know exactly the house that it's happening in, and they're not doing anything. policymakers not doing anything. There are ordinances that they can pass and that they've been asked to pass around this, and they simply haven't, because these ordinances would run afoul of landlords and make things more cumbersome for them. It would require people like companies like Main Street Renewal to actually have some responsibility for the properties that they buy up and then just sit on. Policymakers, nothing. So she contacts her council representative, and he's well aware that this is happening all over Kentucky, well aware of the situation, and he knew he did nothing. He did nothing. So Tamara is not politically apathetic. She's doing all the things, right? But none of the things, including the law, are helpful, right? Tristan or Bryson tries to fight alongside Tamara to affirmatively make the case that Main Street Renewal was negligent, and that as a result of that negligence, they should allow her to remain in the home at the rent she was paying, which is what she could afford. And they fought that fight for 9 months. She was able to remain in that home. And ultimately they lost, and Tamara had to go elsewhere. So I'm gonna wrap up here. I'm gonna say this, right? Part of what Tamara is not idiosyncratic. The longer I did this research, the more people like Tamara that I kept coming across. People who just bumped up against the limits of our systems, like nobody was helping them. It wasn't a question of if Tamara was the victim or not, of if she was right or wrong, or of if she was deserving, even though that should never be the question. But in this case, those weren't even the operative questions, and still no one could help her in the face of these predatory profiteers. And as I kept bumping up against people like Tamara, me and Mallory started saying, like, wait, this focus on procedural justice, on legal justice, is really misguided. And then the same thing happened to Bryson, right? He realizes, I keep trying to sue for things and it keeps not working. And maybe I need to be doing something else. Maybe I need to be working in solidarity with the people who are being affected so that we could have deeper change, right? Because maybe the solution is increasing the supply of lawyers, but changing the structural problems that are leading to the demand for lawyers, right? So the chapter, and here's where I'll wrap, the chapter really focuses on how tenant organizers use the law as a tool, instead of thinking about the law as the solution or justice from the law as an end in itself. They use the law as a tool to build their own power so that they can bring more and more people into their orbit. This is how I came across tenant organizations, because they're in housing court, like trying to get right there where people are experiencing the pain. That's where you draw them in and you help them to see what can be done. And then they push beyond that. And I focus on the different mechanisms for doing this in the chapter, but the whole point is that the book focuses on the limits of legal and procedural justice. Even though it has these positive policy feedback effects that we identify, increasing people's trust when they get lawyers, helping them to navigate the system better, there's some good, right? But ultimately that good is limited. And if we want to start thinking about where the liberation is going to happen, this is from one of our tenant organizing participants, we have to move past that. So that's the arc of the book. But right here in the liberatory change piece is where tenant organizing sits. And as I got to the end of the book, I thought, I am not done with what there is to say about this, and particularly about organizing tenants as a response to a predatory and unjust economy when it comes to housing, right? Those are not the kinds of responses that a lot of the housing technocrats imagine. They imagine, like, whatever, more vouchers, more low-income housing tax credits, more blah, blah, blah. Policy solutions, there's a place for that. But the power piece, the political piece, I think is very much understated. So my next book is about the politics of tenant power and the political economy of tenant organizing. But that's like very vague. So y'all are gonna help me map out the whole rest of it. Thank you.
Rob Mickey will now offer a couple remarks.
Is the pink chair for me?
Your choice.
I don't know.
Your choice.
Is it because should I make you sit in the pink chair, Rob? No, I'm only joking. I'll sit here until you're done.
And then maybe use the mic, right? Oh.
Thanks very much. Grateful to be here. Like Jamila, this work is great and inspiring, I think, for all of us, both as scholars and as citizens. And I'm actually going to talk not much about the chapter, but about my dreams of the book to follow. I would just say for the book's not out yet, and for you students who like to read shorter things, a lot of this work is based on an amazing article that Jamila wrote with Mallory and Chloe Thurston, the title of which escapes me, but is in Perspectives on Politics in 2020, I think. Sorry. Okay. So y'all read that and you'll get a lot of. So I'm grateful also to Jeremy for sending out not just this chapter, but a lot of other of Jamila's recent greatest hits, because it helps me think about this next book. So just some scattered thoughts about this next project. Really taken in a lot of ways, again, as scholar and as citizen with this organization that most social scientists know nothing about, and that's certainly the case with me of tenant organizations. I'm wondering where you get your expectations about for this next book, about how they fare in politics, what they do, right? You, I think, sometimes explicitly, other times implicitly make it a good argument that we shouldn't look to social movements to think about tenant organizations. I'm wondering about how and how not it's useful to think about unions, right? Because the thing that they share is that unions are pooling the market power of workers as sellers of labor, and here tenant organizations are pooling their power as consumers. But obviously there are lots of differences, but it would be nice if unions were the place to go, because you're on a campus with this great center on people who just spend all the time thinking about unions. So, but I'm just wondering about that a little bit. Another thing I'm wondering about is the life course of tenant organizations. So you studied them in this incredibly politicized moment. The language used, especially like in the health affairs article you wrote, I was astonished by. People are talking about intersectionality and racial capitalism and everything, but like citing Piketty, is just, so that was super interesting, but it also raised for me the question of how long they can remain democratically led, right? So if we think back to, I can't pronounce it because I'm from Texas, Robert Michel, is that how you say it? The iron law of oligarchy, that organizations kind of tend to become less democratic over time as the incentives of leaders, and again, I know you make a good argument that a lot of these things don't have leaders, but to the extent that they do, organizations, leaders often over time, their incentives shift in terms of thinking about the longevity of the organization instead of its central purpose. And the language used by some of the folks that you quoted made me a little nervous on behalf of the rank and file, right? Because it sounded like it was not to say Bernie bros is a pejorative, but it sounds like it was younger, better off people doing a lot of the talking. I could be wrong about that. Another aspect of the life course I wonder about is how long they can fend off donors and nonprofit organizations, with which they're competing a little bit. I guess from the point of view of advocacy groups, they're competing with tenant organizations. And again, how long that can last without getting kind of ensnared as leaders want the organizations to perpetuate, to be able to say no to these donors who I think cause a lot more trouble long term. But one other thing about the life course, I was wondering, you give these inspiring stories about victories in local politics. I was wondering what the victories do to their place in local politics, often perhaps reducing their autonomy from elected officials in ways that might affect their futures. I don't know exactly what questions you said the politics of, and that's what political scientists do when they're not ready yet to say what their research questions are. But at least that's what I do. Maybe not Jamila, but a couple of times you alluded to being interested in the conditions under which the organizations emerge and also when they're successful. So first of all, I was just wondering, just broadly, what would a research design for this next book, how might it be different than this one? How might you turn also to your expertise in federalism in helping you think about variation across space? Not just in terms of red, blue, or types of laws, but also variations in local political economy, which I think is the really most important thing. But also, you know, I'm wondering if you have a sense already if tenant organizations are more likely to emerge when local politics environments are less helpful to them, if it's easier for them to organize and emerge and maintain themselves, or if, in a sense, friendlier local politics environments are actually deleterious to their emergence. You do great stuff actually in a bunch of the articles y'all wrote, but on the different kinds of strategies they use. And I'm just, again, wondering about how, not just emergence and success or failure, but how could you help us understand the conditions under which they deploy these different strategies? The last point, and I'm going to, is I just wrote tenant organizations and you. So you're obviously a fan, I think for good reason. And I think a book that brings these organizations to social scientists and demands that we pay attention by itself is incredibly valuable. A book concerned, at least in part though, with understanding these more causal questions might be a little bit different. And here I'm just thinking about, you know, one of your great strengths is listening and watching. And I'm wondering, I guess I'm projecting a little bit, but I'm wondering how, whether and how you plan to be agnostic with respect to their subjective understandings of political economy and local politics. Participants' understandings, like all political actors, theirs are going to range a lot in accuracy, and I'm wondering what you're going to do as a scholar when your perceptions maybe depart from theirs. I would think that these organizers know a lot more about local political economy than almost everybody but real estate developers. But again, I'm just wondering how you, whether you see a tension there and what you might do with that tension. Thank you very much.
He said I should keep my, oh, I have a mic. That's for you. He said I should keep my expectations low. And that's what Rob Mickey does. Oh my gosh, there's so many things to respond to. Okay, maybe just 2 minutes, but I'll try to be fast. I'm gonna look at my notes. Oh my gosh, this is amazing, Rob. There's just so much here. I think you're totally right about the like politics of thing. I am still trying to figure out like particularly what the content is and what's important to kind of say and do. So, and a lot of what you said will guide me there. So quickly on the parallel to labor unions, like absolutely, and a lot of tenant organizations are very explicit about this, and they're both looking for ways to work with labor unions, like to pursue shared political ends, and also looking for opportunities to learn from them. And I think they understand that there tenant organizations are even explicit about whether they call themselves a tenant union or not, depending on whether you're in an area where union is a positive word that will draw people to you, or whether you're in an area where union is, I mean, that's like a explicit strategy, but beyond strategy, they self-understand, many of them, as being a part of the same kind of thing. And in some places like San Francisco, for example, where tenant unions there have really been fighting for collective bargaining rights. I mean, that's like, they're directly imitating what's going on with labor unions, and also trying to learn from their mistake, right? Like, do we really want an NLRB? Like, that might not be the direction we want to go in, given how it's turned out. And so there's a lot of like cross-fertilization there, and in places where the two have worked together. Like, I don't know if anybody's heard of that mansion tax in California. Like, I think it's like a small tax on any home that's over $5 million. That was a collaboration between labor unions and tenant unions. So I think there's a lot there. I love this life course piece. And in part, the life course piece converges with towards the end when you were like, what are you actually going to do? What's the content? Like, because I first started to talk to people in tenant unions in 2020, that's when I first started to think about this, because I just, prior to the pandemic, I had kept seeing them in courts. And I was like, that's really interesting. And then when the pandemic started, I was like, look, like this, the legal stuff was actually like very emotionally and personally taxing for me, because everyone is just getting clobbered in those courts. And sitting there, like observing that, I was like, am I just going to tell a deficit story? Like, what good is this doing? And then tenant organizations would come in the court and everything would be different. The same judge I observed yesterday is now behaving differently because those pews are packed with tenant organizations. And then I'm seeing them it feels like pews in the courtroom sometimes. That's how the chairs are in many of those courts. It's like pews in church. But anyway, that was the only time I felt real excitement. So once the pandemic started and I was like, I really need to do something to not like lose all my motivation, I started interviewing tenant organizations, sitting in a lot of their meetings, which now had all been on Zoom, just spending tons of time observing and talking to them in various ways. But that's now like 5 years ago, you know? And so I've seen some of these organizations go away. I've seen some of them grow. There's tenant organizations. When I first met them, they had 500 people, and now they have 10,000. You're like, there are tenant organizations with 10,000 people? There are, not many, but there are. And I've seen this life course unfold, and that is something that I want to be thinking about in the book. These questions around like how the kind of democratic composition and nature of the organizations change over time isn't as much what I've thought about. I've been thinking about how they navigate changing political waters over time and not about the intra-organizational pieces. So I'll have to think about that. I'm not an organization person. Like some people, like that's what they studied. This I just stumbled onto. So when it comes to the organization pieces, I feel like I'm, an interloper in another person's space. Like I'm like, no, I want to think about the politics. Like however you're managing your internal organization, whatever, the other people who study that can study that. But I'm obviously figuring out that those are not neatly separable. There's a lot more, so I won't say very much more, but I will say like the question of me and what happens when like my own self-understandings of the world are at odds with what so first of all, it's already happened and it happens plenty of times. Part of the reason it happens is because the tenant organizations themselves are very, very heterogeneous. I mean, I've interviewed people in tenant organizations who are themselves landlords. That's not common, but like, and I'm just like, I'm not sure what's going on here. And tenant organizations themselves, there are deep splits. There are big, prominent tenant organizations like Los Angeles Tenants Union, where they're just like, we don't want to do electoral politics. Like, we're going to use the power of the strike. We're going to use the power of disruption. We're going to use action. Like, we don't trust government. We don't want to work within that. And then there are organizations like, and they have tens of that, or over 10,000 members and lots of chapters. And then there are organizations like Kansas City Tenants that has right now around 12,000 members. And they're constantly running their members for election. And now they have like a ton of members that are on the city council. And like very few things actually can happen in that city council without KC Tenants being on board, right? They like stop the stadium from being built, all these things. So they're like, no, we're embedding ourselves in politics. And others are like, no, we don't want to have anything to do with politics, and everything in the middle. So, I mean, I'm somewhere in there, certainly. But there's so much heterogeneity that none of it can become about like me versus like what they think. And I will be honest, like I've been moved in many ways by them. Like I'm learning a lot from them. And then sometimes I think they're wrong. I think their analyses are just not right. And I have very much been a participant observer in the sense that I will have those conversations with them, which is, because part of what these folks want, what they respond to, the reason why they brought me into their world for a prolonged period of time now is because I'm authentic with them. I don't pretend to be some external objective researcher who just doesn't care. And so I don't know that like there's a built-in endogeneity. Like they're reading the papers that you just saw. Many of them will say like, "Do you have any papers on this?" Like, and then they write back to me about like they're affecting me and I'm affecting them. So I don't know. Like I can't say that I'm endogenous to the processes I'm studying. I know I'm breaking all the rules, but so the where I'm implicated is something I have to give really careful thought to because it's a tricky one here.
I'm loving the dialectics in this political economy workshop. So that's great. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the work. Jeremy mentioned that last week a few of us in this room met to talk about many of your papers and to brainstorm some ideas for what we wanted to talk about today. And heterogeneity was one of the big things that we wanted to ask about. So I'm going to get to that in just 1 second. But because I have the microphone, I did just want to say that, you know, I've learned so much from your work, both of you, and you're both people that I really greatly admire. So thank you for being here and sharing space in this way, and especially in the political climate that we're all in these days. Your work is becoming, unfortunately, more and more important every day. And so when I think about, you know, what scholars I want to turn to sort of get guidance for what the future should look like or may look like, or how to diagnose the current reality, I mean, the two of you are people who I definitely look to. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
So on heterogeneity, a much less fun question.
That's very fun.
So a lot of us in our reading group were struck by the variation in the cases that you studied. And a few things that stood out to us were, one, the built environment in these places. I mean, if you compare Queens, say, to rural Kentucky, I mean, these places are very different. We're wondering sort of how the built environment impacts tenant organizing. And then one thing you mentioned in your brief talk today, the legal and policy environment, I mean, that obviously varies significantly between these places as well. How does all that shape what you think about tenant organizing?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me this, because one of the things I've been trying to figure out as I think about the approach in the book. So when I first started thinking about tenant organizing and tenant organizations, I just didn't know anything about them. So I was like, I want to talk to as many different organizations in as many different places as I can, in part because I wasn't sure what to make of the heterogeneity at all. And it felt odd to like just make up like some a priori ideas that would have been based on very little. So I was like, let me just talk to people all over the place. And I did that. And now as I think about the next stage of the research, especially I've been thinking about in the book, like picking some organizations that I really dig deep in. And I've been thinking on what basis, which is what makes me try to put some like rigor to that heterogeneity. Like, how do I think about what are the kind of axes of dimensions of variation that are important that I want to like select cases on? I can't say that I know the answer yet, but I will say like some of the bigger things that I've learned. So first of all, because this is why I said go Queens, like I am from, even though I live in upstate New York now, I grew up in a very urban place. And the ethnography that like really prompted me to think about tenant organizations was happening in big cities, in Atlanta, in Queens, in other parts of New York City. And I really hadn't thought about this in rural terms at all. But then I ended up in Kentucky because the Louisville Tenant Union was like growing and growing and growing, and I kept hearing about it. And the other tenant, you know, once you interview organizers are people who build relationships. So once you interview an organizer, like it's not like you're done with the interview and you go home. Like they have your information. They know you're studying this stuff. So they would reach out and be like, here's this article on what happened in Connecticut. This is what's happening in Kentucky. This is what they're keeping me involved in the world. So that's how I ended up in Kentucky. And then some of the rural folks in Kentucky, I mean, it's just completely different, right? In ways that are really quite significant. So in a way that I hadn't thought of at the beginning, I do think this like urban rural piece is something I can't ignore. I mean, the organizers in Kentucky are dealing with such small places. Everybody knows everybody. That is a very different organizing context. And in some ways it's enabling. Like you can get to more people. You know who's hurting. You like who is in pain, like having housing problems, who maybe you can use that as an organizing tool. But you also know all the landlords, and like one of them is probably related to you. Multiple of them are probably people close to your family. Organizing against an opponent is very different in a rural area than it looks like in a big city where you can be organizing against some like anonymous, like rich person who you really don't care about, right? And there are all sorts of other differences. And so I do think that urban rural piece is important, and I'm still figuring out all the ways it's important, but I think it's very important. And in particular, the challenges around it's hard organizing anywhere, but the challenges in rural areas really struck me, and especially the ways those challenges bring up like the internal politics of the organizations. You know, I'm thinking about a trans woman who was part of the tenant organization, one of the rural tenant organizations in Kentucky. And that became a really big issue. A lot of people in the org did not want her in that tenant organization, or they refused to call her her. They were like, we don't care about, this is mumbo jumbo, this is the left. They're like hardcore tenant organizing, but they don't associate or identify with the left or with Democrats. And so you're getting them to take like what we might think of as action and positions that we associate with the left, but that is not how they're thinking about what they're doing. But if you now want to start telling them to like call this person who they saw grow up as a boy she, that's stupid. I'm like, that's not me saying that. That's like their perspective. And they're not going to do it. And that can become a fissure that upends all of the organizing. And the landlords know that. So now they're making it all about, why is that person? Do you have to call her her? Do you really want to? Like, that's a whole different kind of politics that just isn't happening. I mean, it's happening in Berea in Kentucky, but not even in Louisville is that happening in Kentucky, right? So very different dynamics that speak to like some of the political conditions pieces as well. So yeah, okay, there's a whole bunch more I could say there, but that's just giving you a flavor of some of what I'm thinking. As far as the political pieces, landlords are understood to have very different kinds of power in different places. I've been trying to think about some way of measuring that and selecting on that heterogeneity, because tenants have to organize in relation to that. Like they're organizing in relation to their understanding of certain power dynamics. And there are, I mean, there's one tenant organization I've been working with, and they've been doing a study on like the members of their city council that are landlords. They want to identify who all the city council members are who are landlords, and that is going to shape what their organizing strategy is, right? So thinking about things like that, like where and how landlords have power in different places, that's an important dimension of heterogeneity. It's not an easy one to measure per se, but it seems to be really important for shaping what's happening in a place. Last thing I'll say is that I'm at the tail end. It's taken me 3 years. I'm developing this database of housing organizations at the city level. It's actually wild. We can talk about it more later, but I have to stop, so I can't go into detail. There's a reason it's taken years to build the database. But so we're trying to understand the civic infrastructure around housing in any given community, and that means looking at power building organizations like tenant organizations and other community organizations that might fall into that category. Looking at legal services organizations, which are often part of this infrastructure, even if I don't think they're the main players. And also looking at advocacy organizations. So you mentioned before the push and pull between some of these organizations. And seeing if part of what I'm interested in is, first of all, what's the heterogeneity in the distribution between those different kinds of organizations in different places? For example, we are finding many fewer power building organizations in lots of parts of the Deep South, right? Although it seems like that's been changing over the last few years. And whether the distribution between those different kinds of organizations is shaping like what kinds of politics is emerging in these places and what kinds of demands tenant unions in those places are making, right? Because the demands that are registering in these organizations are very different depending on their political context, and need to be. So anyway, I am collecting some like data to help me start to think about heterogeneity in a more systematic way, but it is hard. I can't say I figured it out.
So you anticipated the next question about demands. I was wondering, think about the broad vision that these organizations are putting forward. Are they thinking sort of on the short term, getting housing, now that's, more just and nicer? Are they thinking the long term, You've written about, co-ops and community trusts. Is social housing on the table?
Yeah.
Is the end of private property on the table? I mean, what are these organizations, thinking about?
Yeah, well, this gets us back to the heterogeneity piece as well, right? It really depends on the organization, and often it changes as the organizations build more power, right? Which is the thing that I've been struck by watching them over the years. So, for example, um, there's so there's one organization. When I first met them, they were working on right to counsel, like that was their thing. They were like, we want everybody to have a lawyer in housing court, and they won that campaign. They got right to counsel, and like a year later, they were like, this really hasn't changed very much. Like the fundamentals have not changed. Like we need to be thinking about something much bigger than this. Um, and then they started thinking maybe rent control, and all of the city council people like, don't even bother. That's not happening. And they're like, okay, what do we need to build power for so that we have different options on the table, right? So I would say there are certainly some tenant organizations that are like thinking about abolishing private property, making it possible for tenants to collectively own their homes, really like rethinking the fundamentals of our market systems with respect to housing entirely. Those are relatively few, because it's hard to hold that position and still like give wins to your tenants. Like you need to win in order to keep people engaged, um, and then there's everywhere along the spectrum. There are, especially in the most challenging political context, many of those tenant orgs will say like, if we could just make sure there's heat in the winter, like we'll start there. And if we can get them to give us heat in the winter, like we can figure out then what the next step is. So they understand that they want to build, but you really have to start where it feels possible to do something, which is why there's such dramatic heterogeneity. But there are many of these organizations that have a big long-term vision. They don't want to just make the current system better. Not all of them. Some of them are kind of like, we just want to make the current system better. But many of them, I would say, want to get to a point where more transformative goals are realistically possible.
I think we have time for a few questions from the audience now.
Open up broadly. Anyone has any questions for any of our panelists?
Yeah.
I didn't know I'd get the microphone, but thank you for the talk. I wasn't on the reading group, but I enjoyed reading your stuff in the past. I wanted to go back to maybe kind of the original question of your book, which was how do kind of these procedural questions and experiences shape people's political lives? So I'm curious about kind of an answer to that, but part of the answer that you came to seems to be that tenant organizations really matter for those political experiences in housing court. Not all the time, but like sometimes they come in and have a really big impact on what's going on.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, how do for like a random person, not an organizer, someone that a tenant organization would like to join them, like how does that impact that person's political life? Obviously sometimes it makes them like join the organization, but like kind of what impact does that have on someone in housing court's life? That's a very like precarious position for them to be in, and there's an organization coming in and saying, hey, we want to help you, we want you to join us. Like what impact does that have? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say quickly that the question of impact is always hard. And actually, the wonderful political scientist at MIT, this is what she heard me say, like, oh, so it's different when tenant orgs are there. Like, we could manipulate that experimentally. We could work with the group of it. And then we could see if outcomes are different. And there's all kinds of possibilities there for thinking about impact. But the way that you invoked impact was like on the person, the tenant sitting there, usually unrepresented, who may not be affiliated with a tenant organization, who sees these people come into the court. Often, like, they're identifiable. They all have yellow shirts. They all have green shirts. They all have red shirts. Sometimes they're disruptive, like they're saying things. Other times they're just sitting there in solidarity. Sometimes when they walk in the room, one of the tactics is sit down next to a tenant and say, hi, we're from XYZ tenant union and we're here to support you, right? That is, it's hard to explain. Like, I can almost get emotional thinking about it, how powerful that is, right? honestly, just having anybody in the room who sees what you're going through is powerful for people. So not having tenant organizations involved at all. One of the ways I recruited people is I would sit in that room, I would watch what happened, and then afterwards I would go up to people and say, you know, I saw that hearing. Like, I'm a researcher. I'd love to talk to you about what you're going through, about what just happened and the circumstances surrounding it. When I say, like, people would be in tears because A, somebody was there who saw it, and B, I wanted to talk to them about it. Like that, those spaces are so lonely and so alienating and so confusing. Like one person there, just me telling somebody I was there, I saw what happened to you. The vast majority of people who I'm a stranger, I just walked up to you. Almost everyone said yes. I mean, that's how desperate people are for connection in that moment. And now there's 50 people in red t-shirts there for you. It changes the whole dynamic of the room. And I can't tell you how many times I would see a tenant say, "Who are y'all again?" Like, "Oh, where can I?" You know, and when I would ask the unions, like, "Do people actually come to meetings who you?" They're like, "Yeah, that's how they're getting people, right?" So it seems really meaningful for people. The politically meaningful piece is key. Part of why it's meaningful for people is because it helps them to start to think that maybe what's happening isn't just about them. These legal problems, people are trained to, I mean, even calling them legal problems makes them an individual level issue, right? And sometimes in the courtroom, people would start to pick up on something else. Like I'm thinking about one time in particular. I promise I'll hurry. I'm so verbose, it's too much. But one time in particular where there were like maybe, I don't know, 24, almost all Black women in this courtroom. It's the same landlord, right? It's not, the landlord's not there. They send their attorney. And each of them is getting up. And if you're one of the later cases tried, and for me, if you're just sitting there from 8:30 a.m. to like, 3, then your heart is like shriveling in your chest. But like, if you're one of the later cases, by the time it gets to you, like they would be saying, you have to know it's not me. Look at everybody who's gone before me. Like, are we just all bad? Like, don't you see? And the judges, that they can't take that position. They're like, I just have to take each case individually. People would get deeply frustrated by that. Why can't, I mean, I have some quotes in the book where people are like, but why can't he pay attention to everything else that's going on in the courtroom before that? Obviously, it's the landlord that's the problem. That's not what that system's meant to address. So when someone shows up and says, I see what's going on here, and it's not about you, I mean, people respond to that like almost like nothing I've ever seen before. I mean, there's a reason why I like reoriented everything and started studying this, and that's why, because I actually haven't seen very many things that move people politically the way that I've seen with my own eyes over and over and over again tenant organizing do it. I hope that answered the question.
Hi. So I'm a sociology grad student, and full disclaimer, I also do organizing work with the Ann Arbor Tenants Union. But I have a
I
question.
interviewed you all. You're in the
Oh,
in the
nice.
cases somewhere. But that was like 5 years ago, so probably doesn't
Yeah,
count.
I'm sure. Yeah, things have changed and also
Yeah.
not changed, or maybe gotten worse or better. A question I had for you, and this is kind of related to the earlier questions about heterogeneity. I'm curious if you investigated or have plans to investigate how tenants organizations work or don't work with other like community organizations or these labor unions in particularly larger cities where there are a lot of community groups who have perhaps overlapping interests, or not if, for example, you said the LA tenants organization does not do electoral work, what that sort of looks like, and if you can kind of understand the motivation behind those groups when they make the decision to work together or not.
Yeah. And to be fair, I do think there are some LATU chapters that do organize. So I don't want to paint them with too broad of a brush, but absolutely. So these, I mean, part of organizing is like it's strategic action. So like these folks, there are different levels of sophistication across tenant organizations, but those on the more sophisticated end of the like political savvy spectrum, to the extent that we can think of it that way, are absolutely looking for which coalitions and partnerships they can build. And so that's like a big part of this. It's challenging because there's often like some shared interest and some conflicting interest. And for the other organizations, like having landlords or people who are otherwise landlord friendly as an opponent when you wouldn't have otherwise, like isn't always an enticing proposition, you know? And so it's not always in, like, for example, labor unions' best interests to work with tenant orgs, because now you're just adding like another set of potential opponents who maybe were indifferent to you before. You already had some opponents and now you have more. So each of these actors, the ones that are more like kind of politically strategic, are thinking about like what their interests are, where their interests overlap, and like what they can do better together, and whether they can do better together. It's not this sort of Pollyanna-ish, like we're always better in coalition. Like sometimes that's not true and sometimes it's true. So the more sophisticated folks are thinking in like really, I think, like clear power relations terms about that. And this is also the last thing I'll say to this, is where some kinds of like both class and racial conflicts can emerge. There are certain, not all tenant organizations are like this, and actually the biggest and most successful ones aren't. But there's a subset of tenant organizations that are very like middle class or middle class adjacent and highly educated. And those folks like are often more inclined and more able to like see this landscape and go out and make all sorts of other build other bridges and make other coalitions. The most grassroots and like I would just say like working class poor folk tenant organizations are often not appearing in ways that like your local DSA is gonna be excited about, or your local like advocacy groups that you might otherwise want to be in coalition with are gonna welcome you with open arms, right? Because you're like cursing and you don't use the right pronouns and you maybe like voted Republican sometimes and you're or you don't vote at all, or you have like there's all sorts of things that make those people like make it hard to organize across some of these bridges. The best tenant organizations are organizations that are working to break those things down, not by changing their like poor and working class folks and making them like align more with, but by like just making the interests clear and giving people pathways to get beyond those divisions, which I think is super exciting. But I guess the answer is it's really hard. That kind of coalitional organizing is hard, but it's happening all over the place. There's lots of potential there. I haven't thought about how to capture it like more than I am. So it's a good question.
Hi, thank you so much. I enjoyed this talk so much, and I'm very excited for both books.
You're waiting a lot longer for one than the other.
Well, it gives me some time to read the first while the other one comes out. So I've been thinking about this from the perspective of I've done a lot of work around housing in Milwaukee in a bunch of different neighborhoods ethnographically. Mostly because of kind of what the processes I was observing. I've interacted with a lot of homeowners in like low income neighborhoods that have been, the targets of predation by like large corporate landlord organizations in mostly single family home and duplex dominant neighborhoods.
Yes.
And so I guess I'm thinking about how tenant organizing responds to this shift. And this kind of gets to the earlier question about heterogeneity, but responds to like the shift in kind of ownership patterns in cities, especially since the foreclosure crisis accelerated by the pandemic, with large corporate landlords getting into the single family home market, and how that looks different to organized tenants who are living in kind of single family homes versus like big multi-family buildings. And I guess I'm also wondering, like, if you're making the target of the organizing these like large corporate landlords, does that open the door to also including homeowners in those neighborhoods that have similar complaints about how these landlords are affecting their neighborhood quality? Just curious about that.
I love these questions.
Yeah, because I've seen a lot in my own work, like some neighborhoods, there's a lot of divisions between renters and tenants, and in other neighborhoods, I think they see themselves more on the same team.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
And-
I'm just super interested.
And part of the work of organizing is helping those folks to see themselves on the same team, right? Well, so there's some organizers that the one question is like, what is a tenant, right? Lots of organizers say homeowners are just bank tenants. You're still somebody's tenant. You still have somebody that if you don't pay them, your house is going to be taken away. I mean, you might think you're special, and you don't have to sign a lease every year because you signed that mortgage. But you still are beholden in different ways, but you're still beholden. And so how do we get homeowners to see themselves as in the same political class as quote unquote renters? You are both tenants, you're just different kinds of tenants. And some of the what I would think of as most successful tenant organizers are pushing in that direction. I mean, this is classic for political scientists. Schaffsnyder, right? Expanding the scope of the conflict so that you could get more and different people involved. And to the extent that you can get quote unquote middle class homeowners involved, that potentially strengthens your political position. So long as you can hold the core around what the goals of the work are, and that can be really challenging. But absolutely, this is on the radar of tenant organizers. And this dynamic, how to bridge class and racial divides to create a tenant organizing space that crosses those spaces, I'm super interested in that because I don't think there are too many current political formulations that are capable of that. I think labor organizing is probably the closest political formation we have that's been consistently capable of that kind of thing, although all caveats, inserted there. There really aren't very many political formations that are capable of doing that. And considering our current politics, it's hard to imagine transformative organizing without the capability of bringing some of these folks in the same room, breaking down some of those barriers. And that means you got to organize the bank tenants too, right? And you have to have them thinking about themselves that way as well. But part of the reason why home ownership appeals in the first place is because it puts you in a different category, a different class, and people want to think about themselves that way. They don't necessarily always want to make common cause with quote unquote renters, but what will change that is common predatory experiences, right? So the more predatory our political economy becomes, and it's only becoming more predatory, the more opportunities there are to help people make common cause. But that will not happen magically just because big corporations are being horrible. It has to be cultivated, and that's part of the role of organizing. To the question of harder to organize in the single family home places, absolutely. That maybe is one of the biggest things that comes up when I'm talking to people in these Rust Belt cities, in Buffalo, in Cleveland, in Detroit. I just did a bunch of interviews in Detroit, and I just you just want to go hide in a hole somewhere. It's just so bad. It's bad. And everybody is getting screwed. Homeowners, low-income Black folks whose homes have been in their families forever. Look, these folks are finding ways of taking their homes, right from under them, legally. And there's nowhere for them to go. And they want to be and they go to the tenant organizations. And they're like, I know I'm a homeowner, but what can we do? So those places might have more opportunities, but it will require a different kind of organizing. That's much more intensive. I mean, the last thing I'll say is that I've been work intensive. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of philanthropic funders about this, who many of these philanthropies have sort of given up on housing because it's so complex and so difficult, and they're just not funding that much housing work. And because no one really quite knows what the answers are, because it's well, probably the things we need most we can't get because of the power dynamics, and I don't know, is it really going to get any better? Maybe only at the margin. So we're not going to fund that. And I've really been why aren't you funding organizing so that we can have some different goals instead of trapping ourselves in this pragmatism around what's possible because we think landlords are so powerful? What if there's another set of people as powerful or more powerful as them, or at least that can reasonably contest their power? Then the realm of possibilities changes, and maybe that's worth investing in. So there are all sorts of political actors that are making decisions based on their understanding of the current political economy. And that has to shift, and it will require many of these places that aren't high rises with thousands of people in them. We have to figure out, organizers will have to figure out how to organize those places, and they are.
So with like 4 minutes left, I'm going to
Sorry.
take the organizer's prerogative
Yes.
and throw a huge conceptual question at the three of you. And Mo can
He's
follow up on
answering it,
this.
I'll
And Mo
tell
can
you
follow
right
up
now.
on this since it's something that we've talked about before. So the question is how much conceptually a frame of structural racism gets us to understand these dynamics. You reference it and describe it in one of the articles that you've written about tenant organizing. But it's not entirely clear as the conversation has unfolded of how all-encompassing that concept can be to understanding some of these fundamental landlord-tenant relations in the broader political economy that seem to transcend perhaps some of that, not necessarily be different or distinct from that, but there's more to it perhaps than that frame. So what does that frame get us? What are possibly the limits to it? And you can all weigh in, but like in a minute a pop before we end. And Mo can follow up too.
I'm joking, but I'm not. I want to hear what he has
No,
to say.
like, I'm not the precious resource here. Jamila is. I'm
You're the
7th
precious
floor, Haven
resource
Hall, come
everywhere.
by. I'm here all the time. Come talk with me. I want to hear what you think.
Oh, that. He is a precious resource. Okay, what I would say quickly is, I mean, I think any conceptual frame is limited, right? I'm not one of those people that is like one thing explains everything. So I don't think structural racism or racial capitalism, which is maybe how I've adjusted in my thinking around how I would talk about it now. I don't think it's like an all cause explanation, but I do think this. I do not think our housing systems as currently structured would maintain if there weren't at least the perception that the people who are being most harmed are not like us. And by us, I don't mean me. I mean like are like basically like Black folks, you know? And I think that the role that poor Black people play in the public imaginary creates a kind of narrative environment that enables the kinds of atrocities that are happening in the housing space to happen. So it's complicated, right? Like, it's not like, well, there's plenty of poor white people that are being absolutely decimated. Or one of the people that I interviewed in Kentucky, lots of white people are being mollywopped, is what she says. I'd never heard that phrase before. I'm so sheltered by racial capitalism, right? That's what she said. They're being mollywopped by what? By racial capitalism. Well, what does that mean? Like, if you're white, what does that even mean, right? It means that you're existing in a system that would not exist as it is if not for the fact that it's disproportionately harming some people. But it turns out that that's harming you too, right? But that one of the ways that's the reasons that's allowed to happen is because you're not the focal point of the harm. So, I mean, and some of that is hard to like, quote unquote, prove. But I just can't imagine that we have a housing system market like the market that we currently have if the people at the bottom of the market aren't disproportionately Black and brown. So that's how I think like structural racism, like why it's a fulcrum, a really important central piece of this, but it's not everything, you know? And people are always surprised. They're like, how come it's not coming up more when you're talking? When I talk to people, even the Black folks that I'm talking to are not describing always their experiences in terms of racism. Like, they really are experiencing the economic dimensions of it, right? But I can see that I'm hearing different things from certain kinds of people than other people, and even that the processes through which these harms are being imposed look different depending on the communities, depending on the people. So that's like an analytical frame that doesn't always emerge in people's experiences, which is why I might not always say it as much, because I'm always thinking about what people have told me about their experiences. But the analytical frame is still important, I think.
And I think that's a great note to end on. So yeah, thank you. Thank you again for